We are back, everyone. So, this is Dr. Jenkins. We just finished talking about the digestive system, and it is a natural progression to then talk about metabolism. We simply have to talk about it. Now that we understand how our body digests and absorbs, and how it digests and absorbs carbs, fats, and proteins, well, the next step after our body digests and absorbs a nutrient is to metabolize it. Whether it's carbohydrates and fat, and we're going to metabolize it mostly for energy, or whether it's protein, which we're going to metabolize a small amount for energy, but the other pieces of protein we're going to metabolize for other purposes in the body. Here we go. And I do apologize. I have a little bit of a cold here. So my apologies for blowing my nose. I really apologize. All right, so, some people can get intimidated by metabolism. Oh, excuse me. And it certainly can be quite complicated. For this level of course, we're just going to skim the surface. So I don't want you to be that intimidated. We're not going to get too specific, but we are going to address it. We are not ones here at Hudson Valley Community College to skimp on the science. So we'll talk about some definitions, then we're going to get into the basics of how we metabolize carbs, fats, and proteins into ATP, and then we'll end with some more general information on metabolic rate, what things make up our total metabolism, and things such as that. So, as you can see, I've already put the most important stuff in red. Okay, so let's talk about metabolism. Make sure that you can define metabolism. I think blue would be a good color today. Metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in the body. I think people tend to just think about metabolism as it relates to the chemical reactions for digestion. And sure, metabolism does include the chemical reactions that occur with digestion, but it also includes all the other chemical reactions. So, metabolism, sum of all the chemical reactions in the body. When we talk about all the chemical reactions in the body, please ignore that. Again, my apologies. When we talk about all the chemical reactions in the body, to be fair, we really only have two types. We have chemical reactions that build something, which are called anabolic chemical reactions. And then we have chemical reactions that break something down, and those are called catabolic chemical reactions. Some chemical reactions are really complicated, and they'll include some anabolism and some catabolism. But in its essence, really a chemical reaction, one in particular, which could be part of a bigger one, but each particular chemical reaction either builds, it's an anabolic reaction. Think about anabolic steroids, we're building muscle, or they're catabolic. And that means it breaks down, like digestion of food. Nice and simple here. So you got the general definitions. Metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions. We have catabolic and anabolic. So we're going to spend this chapter talking about one particular set of chemical reactions. Notice it's not just one chemical reaction, it's a grouping, okay? And that is cellular respiration. So important. I'm circling it. It's starred. It's underlined. Cellular respiration is the series of chemical reactions that convert glucose into ATP. Series of chemical reactions that convert glucose into ATP. The importance of the ATP, which by the way stands for adenosine triphosphate, but you don't need to know that. The importance of ATP is that it is a usable energy. The key word there is usable. We know that glucose, sugar, we know that our cells can use glucose for energy. Got it. But it turns out that glucose itself is not in a usable form. So always, 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 we have to convert that glucose at the last minute right into ATP. Just like a car needs fuel to go, ATP turns out to be the actual usable fuel for our cells. And the steps of chemical reactions that convert glucose into ATP is called cellular respiration. I'm sorry to be a little dramatic here, but I'm trying to drive a point home. This ATP is so important. The chemical reactions that allow glucose to be converted into ATP, they're so important because it's fuel to our cells. And really, without fuel to our cells would die. And that's bad. Okay, before we get into our discussion of the actual steps involved in cellular respiration that convert glucose into ATP, there's a couple other definitions we need to introduce. In these series of chemical reactions that convert glucose into ATP, we have to utilize enzymes. So make sure that I know everyone's heard of enzymes, just make sure that you know what they are, and we're going to talk about a couple of specifics about enzymes. So first of all, enzymes are chemicals that speed up chemical reactions. Maybe a better word to say here are proteins, because I suppose they're classified as chemicals, but enzymes are really these small proteins. And the important thing that enzymes do is they speed up chemical reactions. Okay? Now, theoretically, without an enzyme, a chemical reaction would still happen, but the chemical reaction would happen so slowly that our body wouldn't be able to keep up with its demand for ATP. So even though chemical reactions would theoretically still happen without enzymes, enzymes speed them up so importantly that we need them. So they speed up chemical reactions. Let's talk about how they do it. And the easy way I'm trying to break this down into its simplest form. Simply put, enzymes lower the activation energy. And that's just a fancy way of saying enzymes lower the amount of energy needed. Again, please ignore that. So look at this simple little graph. We have an X and Y axis. Let's say that in a normal situation for a given chemical reaction, because almost all chemical reactions require energy, in most situations, chemical reactions require this much energy, right? This much energy. Well, with an enzyme present, the same chemical reaction can be completed at only this much energy. So wouldn't a chemical reaction happen faster if there wasn't as much energy required? So that's the basis of how enzymes help speed up chemical reactions. They lower the amount of energy needed to complete that chemical reaction. All right, so now that we know the definition of enzymes, let's talk about some characteristics. So in this little drawing here, the enzyme is the purple thing. And what I want to point out, and I think it's on the next slide, but we'll just jump ahead. Specificity. I got to make sure I spell it right. Enzymes demonstrate specificity. And what that means is an enzyme can only fit into a specific substrate. So in this example, this particular purple enzyme can only fit in with this little substrate, whether that's a carbohydrate, protein, or fat, whether it's something else that is involved in a chemical reaction. Other substrates, other things will not fit. So it's kind of like a lock and a key. There we go, specificity. So each enzyme can only work on a specific thing. Let's say that this purple enzyme is amylase. Well, amylase will only work on starch, not protein. All right, so each enzyme can only work on a specific thing. All right, something else that's really important about enzymes is that they leave the chemical reactions unchanged. That's really cool. All that means is enzyme begins, helps speed up chemical reaction. When it's done, the enzyme is still in its normal shape and it can be used over and over again. Isn't that a lovely efficiency of the body? We can utilize these enzymes over and over and over again. It's a good thing. Now, last thing here, sometimes an enzyme has a little extra piece on it called a coenzyme. So remember, in these pictures, the purple thing is the enzyme, right? Sometimes we just need a little helper. Here it says you don't need to know it, but I changed my mind. Just know that a coenzyme is an added little thing, and that sometimes an enzyme needs a little added piece to just make sure it does its job. That's all. Okay, buckle your seat belts, folks. Let's jump right in. So this is the process. Remember, cellular respiration, that's the process of converting glucose into ATP. And remember, ATP is the usable energy source. So this process is a whole series of chemical reactions. It's really complicated, folks. Okay. It's very complicated. What we're going to do is we're going to cover the absolute basics. We're just going to say, this is the first step, something called glycolysis. This is the second step, something called the Krebs cycle. And this is the third step, something called the electron transport chain. They have to happen in order. So we've got a bunch of chemical reactions that comprise something called glycolysis. Once that happens, and only when that happens, can we start the next thing, which are a bunch of chemical reactions that collectively are known as the Krebs cycle. And once we can finish that, we're able to complete the last series of chemical reactions, collectively known as the electron transport chain. It's very important that these steps happen correctly. It's almost like a domino effect where one chemical reaction has to happen for the next one to happen, for the next one to happen. So if you have dominoes lined up, they all need to fall in order for the whole thing to work. If one step doesn't happen properly and that one domino doesn't fall, then the rest of the steps cannot continue. For each of these phases, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, you only are going to be responsible for the very general information, the name of the step, whether it requires oxygen or not, and what the end product is. Okay, so we're going to start with our first series of chemical reactions called glycolysis. Glycolysis is a bunch of chemical reactions that are anaerobic. And all that means is they do not require oxygen. So we start with glucose, we do a bunch of chemical reactions, and we end with something called pyruvate and 2-ATP. I'm going to circle pyruvate as well. So basically, let's keep it very simple. Glucose enters all these chemical reactions. One thing leads to another, and at the end of this phase, we're left with something called pyruvate, and then 2-ATP. We're going to go on to produce much more ATP, but here we just produce 2. It's the beginning. And these are anaerobic. Everything else on this slide is extra. Once we finish glycolysis, that pyruvate which was one of the end products of glycolysis, enters the Krebs cycle. Now, this is aerobic. So now we're getting to chemical reactions that require, big eraser there, require oxygen. It's a bunch of chemical reactions. This happens, this happens, this happens. There is kind of a cyclic effect where it gets its name from. At the end of the day, we began with pyruvate from glycolysis. All these things happened, and we are left with the end products, something we're going to consider mitochondrial enzymes. Particularly, it's the NADH and the FADH. You don't have to know those specifically, other than at the end of the Krebs cycle, we have mitochondrial enzymes. Excuse me again. These steps require oxygen. Lastly, we get to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is also aerobic. And here's where we really get the big bang for our buck. Here we're going to get 34 ATP. Bunch of chemical reactions. We actually start with the mitochondrial enzymes from the Krebs cycle. A bunch of chemical reactions happen, and the payoff is a ton of ATP. So if we were to add these up, glycolysis is going to yield 2 ATP, which we talked about. The Krebs cycle yields 2 ATP, but they get used along the way, so they really aren't going to count towards our total net. And then the electron transport chain yields 34 ATP. When it's put together, 34 plus 2 is 38, but then we lose 2 along the way. For every one glucose molecule, we get 36 ATP. That's pretty fantastic, folks. That's a pretty good yield. So you should know the things that I'm circling, right? Now, what about fats and protein? We just talked about how carbohydrates do things. They go through glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Well, what about fat and protein? Because we can metabolize fat and protein for energy. Basically, I mean, of course there's more to it, but for our purposes, we can just keep it pretty simple. Basically, proteins and fats will enter the Krebs cycle. So, if we talked about for carbohydrates, we had glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Let's use red. Oh, come on. So carbohydrates enter here, and they go through glycolysis, then the Krebs cycle, then the electron transport chain. Versus fats and proteins. They enter at the Krebs cycle. But then they continue on to the same steps of the Krebs cycle and the same steps of the electron transport chain. So in both cases, all three cases, we end up with a total net of 36 ATP net for both the green and the red. Okay. All right. So let's talk about a couple other topics that are related. Let's see. I'm going to skip this slide because I don't think it's really going to help you that much, because I would rather focus on this. So when we talk about how our body regulates, in other words, when do we do more overall cellular respiration? When do we do less? When do we do more catabolic chemical reactions? When do we do more anabolic chemical reactions? All these sorts of things that regulate our production of ATP. And we can kind of break it down into, we tend to have two states. Bear with me here. We have an absorptive state, or we have a post-absorptive state. So when we simplify it here, at a given point in time, you're either in the absorptive state or the post-absorptive state. And these states are dynamic. So throughout the course of a day, depending on what your activity level is, depending on what you eat, depending on what you're doing, then we move between these. So we're constantly. Okay. So the absorptive state, this is the state that we are in after eating, which I suppose makes sense because after you eat, you're absorbing those nutrients. But it might be a little confusing, but let's talk it out here. When we're in the absorptive state, which is what happens after we eat for a couple hours, right? You tend to have more anabolic reactions and less catabolic reactions. We have both. We're always going to have some chemical reactions where you're building anabolic, and you're always going to have some chemical reactions where you're breaking down. But in this particular absorptive state, we just have more anabolic chemical reactions and relatively less catabolic. It doesn't mean that you have no catabolic. After all, we just ate. So don't we need to do some catabolism to break down the nutrients? Of course. But we just tend to have more anabolic. And that is because we can do more building now that we have more energy and more supplies. So even though there's going to be, of course, some catabolism to break down the nutrients, this is when your body builds more. This is when your body rebuilds its muscle. This is when your body rebuilds its tissues. And it can do more building because you have more fuel. You just brought in fuel. Yes, it had to get broken down, but now we have more fuel for building. Which means that on the other side of the coin, we could be in the post-absorptive state. This would be anytime we haven't just eaten, so between meals, overnight. And this is when we're going to have more catabolism and less anabolism. Of course, you're going to have some building, but not as much. If you haven't eaten for a bit, you're not going to have as much energy to build. And if you haven't eaten for a while, your body has to rely on stored fuel. And if we're going to use stored fuel, whether it's stored adipose tissue or glycogen, stored sugar, we have to break that down. So your body expends a little bit more in breaking down catabolism. All right, so we're going to end here, and I'm going ahead, but I'm going to go back. I'm going to end here, this last portion of this chapter, by talking about our total metabolism. And I went ahead because I really like this pie chart. This pie chart represents our total metabolism. And if we can think back to our definition of metabolism, all of our chemical reactions, then this pie chart, because it's representing our total metabolism, it's representing where all of our chemical reactions are. So if I go back, this is our total metabolism, whether we say total metabolic rate, or in a simplistic way, we can also think total metabolism. It's all the energy that our body needs to fuel everything, but it's also all the chemical reactions needed because they go hand in hand. Don't focus so much on this slide. What I want to focus on is this pie chart. make sure you know the 3 components of all of our metabolism. And you might be surprised. Our basal metabolism, basal metabolic rate, makes up most, about 3/4 for most people, of all of our metabolism. You should know that number. That basal metabolic rate makes up about 50 to 70% of all of our metabolism. Make sure you can define basal metabolic rate or basal metabolism. This is the energy needed for our essential body activities. What that really means is energy needed to keep organs working at rest. So what this means is, even if you sat on the couch all day, not that you would do that, but even if you did, even if you sat on the couch all day, your body is still burning calories. It's still producing ATP because your body has to keep all its organs going. It takes energy to keep your heart pumping, your liver going, your kidneys going, everything. So the energy needed just to keep our basic organs functioning takes up a lot of our overall metabolism. I'm not going to ask you what I'm about to put here, but if you're interested, if you take your body weight in pounds and multiply it by 10, this is an estimate. Again, I can't tell you exactly, but this gives you a ballpark of how many kilocalories needed for your basal metabolic activities. I'll use myself as an example. I'm about 150 pounds. So 150 times 10 is 1,500. So for a 150-pound person, about 1,500 calories are burned each day just to keep your major organs going. It's pretty incredible, huh? And that makes up most of our total metabolism. Then make sure you review the other components. TEF is a fancy way of saying thermal effect of food. About 10% of all of our chemical reactions are occurring towards digesting our food. And then, of course, the most variable would be physical activity. This would be taking the stairs instead of taking the elevator. This would be walking around the mall. This would be exercise. So for most people, it's about 20 to 35%. But this is the most variable. In other words, you have direct control over that. You could choose to be more active or less active. You don't have much control over how many calories it takes to digest food, and you don't have as much control over your basal metabolism. Some things affect basal metabolism, like age, genetics, activity level, but those influences on basal metabolism are kind of low compared to the fact that we have total control over our physical activity. There's no extra credit. How did that get on the screen? I'm sending the wrong message here. We're going to end on this slide and make sure you know these 3 components and their approximate percentages. All right, folks, another unit down. Nice job.